Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome, everybody, to the Two Wings Seminar, a production of the Holy Apostles Faculty and Community. St. John Paul II wrote in his Fidesit Ratio, "Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, to know himself, so that by knowing God, men and women may also come to fullness of truth about themselves." That's what this program is about. We started this program last year around this time, and if you'll go to wcatradio.com/2wings, you will find all of our shows from last year. And I expect that this year's season will provide us with another excellent cropping of shows. Now, I'd like to introduce you today to Pat Flynn, who is with us today. Hello, Pat.
Oh, hello. Thank you for having me yet again. It's quite a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, you brought closure to our season last year. Now you're opening the season this year. So I thank you for your commitment to this radio show and to this station. I'd like to share with the listeners who Pat Flynn is. He's the author of 4 books, mostly on fitness, and the host of 2 WCAT radio shows. He has Sunday School on Sunday afternoons, and he has I Thought You'd Like to Know on Monday evenings. He is getting today's Two Wings Seminar. If you would like to hear more about Pat from WCAT Radio, just click on those other 2 shows on our website, WCATradio.com. Pat has a website called chroniclesofstrength.com, where he teaches his followers about generalism, that is, the skill of being good to great at many things, rather than the best at just one, and combining these talents in a unique stack to better themselves and the world. And in his work on his own podcast and on WCAT Radio, Pat brings a great deal of light and joy to the world. So one final thing about Pat, he sometimes has his wife Christine on his program, and both Pat and Christine are devoted to raising their ever-growing tribe of kids proudly Catholic. With that, Pat, we're looking forward to your presentation today entitled "The Difference of Jesus and the Difference He Makes." Take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody who is either tuning in live or will be listening to this afterwards. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on my own biography because a lot of that is built into the piece that I've written and I'm going to present today. So this is an apologetics piece, or perhaps an exploration is a better way to describe it. And the brief history of me is I was not always a Catholic. I wasn't even always a Christian. So I went through a very long searching period myself before I became a Christian and eventually a Catholic. I actually, for a very long time, considered myself to be an atheist and then spent a good amount of time in that spiritual but not religious camp. So I've really kind of gone through the entire gauntlet, so to speak, and it was my love of and study of philosophy that sort of originally took me away from faith, but then many, many years later, through the works of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and people of that sort, brought me right back in again. So I want to share a little bit of that with you. And I do a lot of apologetics work these days. I do a lot of writing. I do a lot of speaking. I'm fortunate to have opportunities such as these to share my story and to share some of the arguments and the articles that I've developed. And my approach, and part of what I do in general, is this idea of minimalism, or always presenting a sort of minimum effective dose for whatever the goal is, for whatever the task is at hand. Now in fitness, it might look something like, okay, you want to get good at this, so here's the fewest things you need to do to reach that goal. Makes sense. When you really think about it, you probably don't want to be anything other than a minimalist because it means you're either doing something ineffectively or inefficiently. So when I started to do apologetics work, when I became really interested in trying to explain and defend and present the Christian faith, I really wanted to develop a minimum effective apologetic. My goal was to lower all the unnecessary barriers to entry that so many people, including myself for the longest time, often get held up on when it comes to the Christian religion. Many of these just tend to be very hot political topics or hot political issues that are, for the most part, wholly irrelevant to entry into the Christian religion. I'm not saying they're not important questions. I'm not saying that, especially when it comes to certain doctrine and dogma and theological differences, they're not important questions, but they're not fundamental questions. They're not the most essential questions. So the questions that I have been most interested in answering for people are what I believe the two critically essential questions that any person must ask and answer in the affirmative to become a Christian. And those two questions are, one, does God exist? And two, is Jesus God? And it's my contention that if you can answer these questions, and you can answer them both in the affirmative, then you have every reason for becoming a Christian. I think if you can answer yes to both of these questions, it would be very silly to then not become a Christian. So then any other holdup that you might have around any particular doctrine or denomination or what have you, again, great questions that are very much worth considering, but they're really questions that you can consider as a Christian. So I guess you could say I'm sort of a mere Christianity type of guy. C.S. Lewis said, let's get people into the hallway of Christianity, and then once they're there, you can kind of pick a door, which means a denomination. Now, it's no surprise that I picked the door. I've been solidly seated in the room of Catholicism for some time now. But my efforts, my skills have been applied mostly, again, to this minimum effective apologetic and trying to get all the obfuscation out of the way and really focus on the essentials, the two most pressing and imminent questions that absolutely demand our attention. Does God exist, and does Jesus God? And is Jesus God? Excuse me. Now, in my work, and if you've been in apologetics for a while, what you'll typically realize is, you can develop a really solid philosophical case for God's existence. Right? And then when you get to Jesus, the arguments tend to change from philosophical to historical. So what I wanted to try to present was more of a philosophical argument for Christ and his divinity and resurrection. And it's not ignoring the historical evidence. The historical evidence is what eventually convinced me. I think it's quite successful, and I think when one really takes the time to investigate the history surrounding the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, you come out with a certain bare minimum number of facts that need to be explained, and it seems that the only thing that can really explain these things is that Jesus actually was who he claimed to be. Nothing but the resurrection makes sense. And that's pretty traditional, right? You hear of this. This is called the minimum facts approach. It's been a popular approach for years. And again, I think it's a good approach. I think it's successful. I think it gets people's attention. But I wanted to buffer that. I wanted to build that up with a philosophical case. So you can kind of think of my argument as something that you can layer in addition to really strengthen the historical perspective around Jesus. Now, if you want to get into the deep history, I think, you should consider works like N.T. Wright's Resurrection of the Son of God and things like that. I mean, if you really want to dive into that side, it'd be hard to do much better than that. My project was this, and I will be presenting it in full and reading it to you, and I do hope that you find it interesting and compelling, is I wanted to kind of treat the entire matter as far as possible philosophically and see, can we develop the right framework and the right perspective that would not only allow for something like the resurrection, which means would not only allow for something like a miracle to happen, which means we must have some type of theistic or God-permitting philosophy, but are there things that we can consider and should be considering that would make something like the resurrection not only possible but likely? Because if something is likely, if something is not only possible but likely, well, then the amount of on-the-scene evidence we then need to confirm that thing actually happened is then a whole lot less than if we didn't have that prior or conditional evidence. And I'm not going to get too far into this now because it's the heart of the piece, but the way I try to formulate it is in sort of a detective scene or a crime scene, in the sense that if you already suspect that somebody's a criminal and there's these ideal circumstances where such a crime is likely to occur, then how much evidence on the scene do you actually need to convict that person? Well, it's hard to say exactly, but it's certainly less than if you didn't already suspect that this person was a criminal and those situations for which you might expect the crime to occur didn't exist. So that's sort of the case that I wanted to present and wanted to develop. And it's not wholly original to me. Philosophers have made probabilistic arguments like these before. Richard Swinburne comes to mind. But I don't think that any of these have been really brought down to an accessible, popular level, or that didn't involve a whole bunch of probability calculus. So I'm not getting into any math here, but I am trying to establish the case philosophically, and then I'm happy to talk resources if you want a deeper presentation of this style of argument later. So without any further ado, I'm going to read the article. There's a lot of stage setting. There's a lot of background. I share a lot of my story, and it sort of builds over time. So it is a little bit lengthy, but I think you'll find it interesting. I hope you find it interesting, and ultimately I hope you find it convincing. That's the whole spiel, right? So, okay. Let me enlarge my text here and see if I can read through this thing without too much squinting. This is, of course, called The Difference of Jesus and the Difference He Makes. Here we go. You often hear many things about Jesus. Many things such that he was the Son of God, or perhaps many other things such that he was not the Son of God, but an enlightened teacher of some sort. Perhaps you have heard that Jesus never existed, and that he was a legend along the lines of a Hercules or Thor, or Chinnamunda perhaps. No matter where you go, and especially if you go looking online, there are many things you will hear about Jesus. As somebody who was not always a Christian, in fact, for many years I considered myself to be an atheist, but who became religious after an unexpected encounter with grace. I am now, mind you, permitted to use phrases as these. That was the right I gained at baptism. I can tell you that the person of Jesus is the most stupefying figure in all of human history, and by far the most frightening for those who consider him seriously. He simply gives one the chills when you stop to think about it. And since my coming to realize this, since that is my coming to Christ, I've come further to grip with the fact that a lot, maybe even most people, do not see Jesus in quite the way he intended us to, do not see him as frightening or stupefying or all that different or amazing. Even many of those who profess to, in their creeds, do not see him this way. I say this not condescendingly, but as a relative outsider and newcomer to the Christian tradition. I think even many of those who are brought up within the Christian religion are simply used to or otherwise indifferent toward the utter peculiarity of the person of Jesus Christ. His story doesn't strike them in the same way it struck me, peering in as I was through the stained glass window. In that sense, what I am about to propose is not so much an apologetic as an exploration. I want us to look into the difference of Jesus and the difference he makes. So I had been an atheist for many years, as I said. Modern culture had done a thoroughly convincing job in removing from me any sense of belief in the supernatural or God or divinity or what have you. I was ardent in my naturalism, committed to my materialism, and strict in my scientism, which is that quaint and simple little notion that unless something can be empirically verified, that something is really not worth talking about. Now, we need not get into all the problems with that particular worldview today. We only need to see that it's wrong, if only for the fact that it fails to meet the very standard it sets for everything else. You can't, of course, verify scientism scientifically. My turning point, however uncommon, was centered around the study of consciousness and how the phenomena so continually refused, not just in particulars, but in principle, to be susceptible to any full-on materialistic explanation for why something so seemingly, immaterial exists. Eventually, I became convinced that despite all its physical correlates to the nervous system and brain, the most basic and fundamental feature about each and every one of us, that is, that we exist and are aware that we exist, could not and did not and never would fit neatly within a completely naturalistic, read atheistic, paradigm. There is no doubt something immaterial, indeed something irreducible within. Well, I'll be, I eventually admitted, if the supernaturalists weren't right all along. It seems we do have a soul. This caused me to renounce, however gradually, my allegiance to atheism and take up something of a vanilla brand spirituality. That, for me, was step number one. I soon then began a study of the world's many religions and traditions and faiths. I found myself, as I think many recovering atheists do, attracted to Buddhism at first. It seemed a practical religion and one with not too many metaphysical commitments, which for somebody still sweating off the after effects of a deeply materialistic philosophy, found perfectly easy to digest. Plus, meditation proved useful to me. Helped me with a lot of psychological issues I had going on, anxiety in particular, a few of which I now believe might be fairly attributed to my previous many years-long commitment to atheism. Daily contemplation of a life without objective meaning is no way of keeping the serotonin levels up, I've come to learn. Fast forward a few years to the next event. A philosopher friend of mine, who also happened to be a Christian, asked what I thought about Jesus one night as we were discussing things spiritual and philosophic. At this time, I'll fully admit, I had not thought very much about Jesus at all. I told him I believed Jesus to be another one of those myths or archetypes or perennial truths or what have you. A person or legend, perhaps, who came and taught all the same basic and obvious things that virtually any other spiritual sage or guru instructed throughout human history. He seemed a nice man, I told him. I should like to have met him. I once said the same of Benjamin Franklin. But other than that, I had no reason to think there was anything all that special about Jesus. I just didn't see him as being different. My friend glanced furtively in my direction and said through a most inspired remark, "You must never have read much about Jesus." I didn't know exactly what he meant by this, but it roused my curiosity enough to run a tape that one of my meditation teachers had recommended, a tape that attempted to explain Jesus through an Eastern spiritual perspective, Jesus as a quote-unquote enlightened leader. At first, I enjoyed the tape, as it attempted to look at various verses of the Bible and interpret them through the lens of a certain mystic tradition, attempted to explain Jesus as someone who is simply teaching others about the great spiritual wisdom that resides within and is available to all, if only we could just put our gosh darn egos aside. But as the tape went further along, I found myself becoming less convinced. It all seemed somehow contrived, forced, and even at times insincere. This caused me to do something I had never in my life considered, going out and obtaining a Bible, and then reading it. I began with the New Testament. What struck me, and none of this took all that long to realize, was just how unlikely any of the well-known spiritual gurus or teachers Jesus actually was. I could easily enough see how a person might pick a line here or there and turn it this way or that to fit with their religious or non-religious perspective, just as people are apt to do whenever a political opportunity arises with relation to Christianity. But when taken as a whole, when reading things within at least what I believe their appropriate context in relation to one another, especially in relation to the letters of the apostles and so on, there was no more getting around it. Jesus was not here to preach enlightenment. Jesus was here to preach the kingdom of God. And the God of which Jesus taught and spoke, the God even more surprisingly he claimed to be the only begotten Son of, was not some vague or ambiguous all-permitting life force of the such one might encounter on a romantic getaway to the California Bay Area, but the one true God of the people Israel, the maker of heaven and earth, the creator and sustainer of all there is and ever will be, a God that is wholly distinct from, but not at all indifferent toward, his creation. Jesus was a Jew. That we know well. And the Jews, if we know anything about the Jews from that time, rejected pagan traditions, a plurality of gods, and general vanilla bland spirituality. They called Jesus rabbi, and no rabbi ever went around preaching enlightenment like the Buddha did. These were the facts that had to be dealt with, facts that were altogether very simple and clear. And so it was the straightforward radicality of this person, Jesus, that forced me into a classic philosophical snare, a dilemma commonly presented and encountered by people in contemplation of Christ. Either this man was a loon of the most impressive magnitude, the likes of which had never been seen before or since, that is, there was something seriously and intrinsically and clinically wrong with him, or there was actually something to what he said, something deeply and disturbingly, if only because it seemed so probably true. Thus began my study into Christianity. It was so unlike any other religion out there. No other tradition which I had previously come across staked everything on events they say really happened and were really recorded, events that attached themselves inherently to the miraculous, events that were traceable and investigable. I will now tell you what I discovered, as obvious as this may seem to many Christians. Please forgive me if this is redundant in any way. I am now just getting a hold of things. Well, on first account, I discovered that the God of the great monotheistic traditions was precisely the same God, at least in the most general regard, that any person of a philosophical disposition could deduce through acts of reason alone, just as thinkers such as St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle and many more contemporary saints have themselves demonstrated. A God that is eternal and timeless and spaceless and so on, an unchanged changer or unactualized actualizer, if you will. A God that explains why anything exists over nothing. A God that is extremely powerful, all-loving, and knows everything that's true and nothing that isn't. The quote-unquote God of the philosophers, as it were. That appealed to me, because I had always figured if God exists, then he might open himself up, if not completely, at least partially, to rational inquiry. Even more pressing than that, however, was the question that occasioned in me next. If God exists, which I now very much believe to be the case, is he, one might rightfully ask, the kind of God that would want us to know something about him? Further, is he also the kind of God that might do something so interesting and spectacular as become incarnate in man, as the story of Jesus claims, suffer tremendous sorrows and pains on our behalf, ultimately get himself killed, and then, by the work of what can only be called a super miracle, sign off on his divinity by coming alive again? Is the God that can be reached by reason compatible with the accounts of revelation in Scripture and the Christian religion as a whole? That, ultimately, was the question that needed to be asked. Many of the younger generations these days, and surely some of the older as well, have been inclined to spirituality without what seems to them the many pointless and arbitrary restrictions of religion. This also had much appeal to me once, until I came to this very point, because the question I was ultimately asking was this: if God exists, is there any particular way that he wants us to practice our having a relationship to him? If so, then that is the way we ought to do it. For it would surely be very silly, indeed, if not, dare we say, blasphemous, upon knowing that God wanted us to have a relationship with him in some particular sort of way, to then go off and continue inventing spiritual practices and traditions and habits that we might prefer better just because. But this is precisely what the Christian religion claims. It claims that God exists and came down to earth, revealed himself to us in a most unexpected way, and wanted to set the record and relationship straight with humanity. And he wanted to set the record and relationship straight because we were so wretched and corrupt for reasons we have yet to explain but will eventually consider. And then he left us with a church. He left us with instructions on how he wanted us to know him and love him. He left us with a religion. And if all of this is true, especially if a person already knows about it, it then becomes preposterous to proceed in whatever direction they choose because they think they somehow know God better by attending a weekend-long yoga retreat in the Galapagos or somewhere. This is not to say a person can't experience God and enjoy his presence and creation in any pattern and instance of life. One would, in fact, hope this to be the case. But it is to say that if God gave us clear, explicit instructions on how to enter into a relationship with him, we had best pay attention to what he had to say. We had better follow God's religion rather than our own. Returning now to the account about Jesus, I believe the greatest mistake people make when looking into Jesus historically or in any other retroactive respect is not first asking the questions I previously posed. If God exists, then might he or would he probably do something like we have in the account of Christianity? For example, might God want to reveal himself to us throughout history? And might he in some capacity want to share in the suffering we as humans experience? Might God want to redeem us from sin and raise us to a higher level and restore our relationship to him? Might God, who again, we have reason to believe, is all-loving and all-powerful and knows everything and only everything that's true, might that God do something like any of those things? Or to make the matter even more interesting, if God did not exist, then what is the probability that something like any of that would have seemed to have occurred? From that angle, that is, the opposite approach, the answer would appear to be so enormously improbable, it virtually forces assent the other way around, that it not only seems eminently plausible that God might want to do something like everything just described, but also, in light of all the prior and conditional circumstantial evidence we have, it seems he absolutely did do something like everything just described. It seems God really did become incarnate, suffered for our sins, died, and rose again. What I am getting at here is an investigation, first into the prior evidence and conditional circumstances that come before and surround the story of Jesus, as well as that which succeed him. What I am saying is something known to any detective or investigator worth whatever salary they receive, that if we have good reason before the quote-unquote crime, let's call it, to suspect that such a crime might occur, and a seemingly ideal set of circumstances wherein such a crime is likely to occur, then the amount of evidence we need to secure our conviction at the scene of the crime itself is then considerably reduced if such prior and conditional evidence did not already and in fact exist. Perhaps knowing that John has a tendency to steal and has been suspected of stealing before, and that every time John steals, he does so on a Sunday and from a particular store in his own neighborhood, and that the only time he does steal is when the funds in his bank account become sufficiently low, say after an overdraft, how much evidence at the scene of the crime do we then need to form the conviction that John committed it? The answer is sure to be quite a bit less if we had no prior evidence to suspect that John was a thief, and are without the conditional circumstances that make us all the more suspicious of him. In other words, that the crime was committed on a Sunday and to the same particular store, and, coincidentally enough, just after John overdrew his account again. I am not going to speculate just what such evidence would have to be to put the man away, but clearly what's required to convict us that John was the perpetrator is now far reduced, having known of John's history and the circumstances at hand. We might even say that John was never previously charged, only suspected, so that John would have had no motive to have learned his lesson or adjusted his behavior in any way. Certainly, if the crime were committed in just those circumstances, John should be our immediate first suspect. We should go right away to knock at John's door and question him on where he was Sunday night, and begin asking other people who knew John if they saw him acting suspiciously or something worse. Now, is it possible there are other theories to explain what may have happened? Is it possible this was all set up and that John is, despite all evidence to the contrary, innocent? Well, of course, other theories are always possible, no matter how strong the evidence may be in one direction or another. But the question isn't about what other theories are possible. The question is about what theory, if any, makes sense of what we already know. We're not trying to invent whatever theory we can. We're only trying to determine who's guilty. Such is the difference between investigation honestly and sincerely conducted and much of modern New Testament scholarship. One is concerned with what really went on, the other with the construction of any new, however spectacular theory that might lead to publication, recognition among peers, and a publicly broadcast television special. Returning to Jesus, we not only have prior evidence to believe that God exists, but also that he is just the sort of God who might do something like become incarnate, share in our suffering, and redeem our sins. That just makes sense, given what we already know. Even if we were not able to predict how all this might have happened at the time, people were anticipating redemption and a Messiah of some sort. The method may have been unusual, but the general thing had long been expected to occur. Following that, we then have the actual evidence at the scene of, again, I hesitate to call it a crime, since the only crime committed was against God himself when the Romans tortured him and then killed him on the cross, but no doubt you get what I'm saying. We have the evidence of the conviction of a person, Jesus, on charges of blasphemy, on claims of being the one true Son of God, and of having the ability to forgive sins and redeem the human race, which could only amount to absurdity if he wasn't who he said he was. We next have the evidence of his being buried in a private tomb after his public, humiliating, and excruciating death, and of the tomb being shortly thereafter discovered empty. Further, the additional evidence of people and groups of people claiming that Jesus, who'd been bodily resurrected, according to them anyway, had appeared to them over the span of 40 or so days. These are not heavily contested historical data points and are easy to affirm by any person determined to investigate them. The only real question is, how do we make sense of them? At this point, a person looking at just the scene of the crime, as it were, but not at any of the prior or conditional evidence, may speculate any number of bizarre hypotheses. Maybe people were hallucinating, or maybe people stole the body and ran away with it. Or maybe Jesus just survived the execution attempt, and in a deeply mutilated state of intense blood loss, by the sheer power of positive thinking and repeating affirmations such as one can do whatever they put their mind to, found it within himself to move a gigantic boulder and continue his ministry and preaching despite having just been previously flogged, mutilated, crucified, pierced in the heart, and pronounced dead. So maybe that happened. Or maybe none of those theories make sense at all. How do groups of people have the same hallucination, especially those who weren't followers of Christ to begin with? Did somebody drop chemicals in the water to cause all this unimaginable hoopla? If so, well, if that's what a person thinks, they might just as well go on with believing all the stuff of modern-day conspiracy theorists regarding government chemicals and water treatment plants and the devastating impact this has had on the sexual orientation of frogs. Or did the disciples of Jesus simply run off with the body and somehow prop up an otherwise desecrated corpse to deceive people so that they could, many of them at least, go on to their own persecution shortly thereafter? At this point, I am only attempting to explain the theories to see how each of them might fit, which is really only to discover that none of them, so far as they go contrary to the Christian account, explain anything at all. None of them can make sense of anything that happened, and just about all of them make total nonsense of what we know did happen. But even more flagrant than that is this. None of these particular theories are considering the prior or conditional evidence that God, in fact, exists, and not only that he might have been very much likely to have done something like raise Jesus bodily from the dead, but actively and actually admitted to doing so through the mouth of Jesus Christ himself. He confessed to committing exactly what Christians accuse him of doing. The perpetrator has conceded his own guilt. And then there is, of course, the succeeding evidence, or what happened next. The undying tenacity of those who profess the resurrection, the willingness to go to any length, including death, to spread the news of the risen Lord, the moving of the holy day of worship suddenly to Sunday from Saturday, and the rapid rise and reach of the Christian religion. If the prior and conditional and on-the-scene evidence were not sufficient already, we now have something like John, the suspected thief, going off and buying himself a yacht and plane tickets to Bermuda and a very nice watch as well. At what point does a person simply have to accept the charge that God is guilty, that he really did do what he professed to doing and that we always expected he might do in some form all along, that he really did become incarnate, die for our sins, rise from the dead, and give us the Christian religion and church? That is the difference of Jesus, put simply enough, and now I would like to discuss the difference he makes. If, in other words, the first part of our discussion was about whether we have reason to believe the Christian religion is true, the next part will be about whether we should want it to be. We all know deep down, and here we must now take full account of the existential, how great a difficulty there is in explaining our existence without some sort of higher, call it religious context. There are, in particular, 5 not insignificant questions with which we are presented in life, and toward which science and philosophy can provide little to no clear response. They are, where did we come from? Who are we? Why are we here? How are we to behave? And are we going anywhere after this? In other words, origin, identity, meaning, morality, and destiny. These are the 5 most critical and essential questions to our everyday lives, and they are, I would contend, the 5 questions most left a mystery from any God-restricting point of view, and indeed, even within most every other God-permitting point of view, they are not wholly accounted for. Christ, however, can answer them all, and he can answer them well. Science, God bless it, may tell us something about the etiology of our existence, or how one chain of physical events has led to another chain of physical events, but it is otherwise totally silent on the ontology of our existence, or why something rather than nothing. That is not a question science can answer, not even in principle. That is a philosophical question to start and a theological question to finish. Origin is empty on the scientific account. Same with identity. It was, as I said at the beginning, a hard study into the nature of consciousness that led me out of my materialist paradigm, the discovery of something like the existence of a soul. I really don't know how better to describe it. Or the fact that we are more than just our bodies. We are, in other words, composite in some way, one part material, another part not. And so long as that immaterial aspect remains, science, which is by definition the investigation into the material, will have nothing to say about it. Meaning, morality, another set of empty, possibly pointless categories with regards to science. Neither meaning nor morality can be found in a test tube. There are no known or even conceivable empirical tests that can be run to validate either. These are philosophical, and again, I would contend, ultimately theological questions, not scientific ones. Finally, destiny. Certainly, if there is an afterlife, science has almost nothing to say about that. How could it? None of this, to be clear, is a derisive mark against science and the productive power of the empirical enterprise. This is only a demarcation of methodological limitation, a sensible accounting of what science can and cannot do or explain. Science, and I don't believe any clear-minded advocate of empirical investigation would disagree with this, is in fact most useful and powerful when considered in the right philosophical and religious context, and not, as many have since fallen victim to, and as a philosophy or religion itself, a mistake I myself had previously fallen victim to. Science presupposes philosophy. So if any scientist does not study philosophy going into their practice, they are likely to assume a philosophy coming out of it and risk it not being a very good one. But what about Christ? Can he answer these questions for us? Can God himself tell us who we are and where we come from and what we're supposed to do with our lives? Can he further elucidate to us what the point of our existing is exactly and where we might be headed after this, if anywhere? I believe, in fact, that he can do this. And I'll make the claim even more contentious by asserting the Christian religion is the only religion on offer capable of answering these questions both consistently and adequately. Let us explore a few of these answers now. Let us see the difference that Jesus makes. Christianity, in the basic sense, the mere sense, the general sense, or however you want to have it, the Christianity as most Christians believe in it, is what I'm trying to say, says something like this. God exists and created man out of love and for each other and for himself. He also gave man the freedom to choose. That makes sense to me. For if there is no ability to choose, then there is no ability to love. Love must be something decided. If there is any such thing as love at all, forced affection is a contradiction in terms, not to mention an abomination in practice. Nobody feels anything like love from somebody coerced into a relationship. They often feel precisely the opposite. So perhaps we think love is the highest good of all. I would agree with that, as would, I think, most everybody. It seems that God would agree with that as well. We're all in agreement then. Very good. So, God wanted us to be loved and for us to love him back. But for that purpose, he needed for us to be free. But there was a risk. For if we have the ability to choose God and to love God, and for that choice to be valid and meaningful in any real sense, there must also have been provided an alternative to choose not God and not love. And so the Christian account says this is, at some point or other, precisely what happened. Humanity chose itself over God, and through that very act, sin and suffering came into the world. That sin not only deformed us, but alienated us. It bent us over ourselves and distorted our perceptive abilities. We were no longer able to see straight. We were no longer able to respond as clearly and readily as before, particularly with respect to God and our relationship to him. We became corrupted, corroded. We fell. Something had gone seriously wrong. God, of course, allowed this all to happen. He could no doubt have prevented this from happening by plopping us in heaven as contented marionettes right from the very start. But God did not intend for us to be marionettes, contented or otherwise. God intended for us to be free, and he apparently thought it worth the risk in having it so. But since God is all good, and because God is all-knowing, we can trust that he has measured this risk appropriately. We can trust that he knows some greater good is to come out of this eventually. We need not speculate what those greater goods may be. We only need to know they're possible in one sense and guaranteed in another. Though I'm sure in each of our lives, there have been points of suffering so immense and unbelievable that at the time it all seems so entirely senseless and gratuitous that it could not be anything aside from absurd. And it is only much later that we can look back upon such periods of life and see that it guided us in some generally better direction. Perhaps it even turned our lives around, and in a way we might never had expected, or perhaps not. Perhaps the answer is yet await. But all this, in one way or another, is surely the answer to that rather very difficult problem of pain, or why, if God exists and is all good and all powerful, such suffering and evil exists also. The short answer is sin. The longer answer is freedom and love. And the more complicated, but I believe correct answer, is because something much greater, something that will so far outweigh any finite temporal suffering, is going to come of this eventually. But back to the original point. Humanity, according to Christian belief, entered into something of a state of rebellion against God. We chose ourselves over God, and that really did us in. Oh boy, did it. But God loved us nonetheless and wanted us for himself. Unfortunately, we had so damaged our relationship to him that it became virtually impossible for us to rectify the matter ourselves. Sin had so obfuscated and abused and disoriented us that we became wholly incapable of restoring that perfect state of grace we once descended from. The amount of injustice we committed against our all-loving Creator is so unfathomably hideous and large. To turn our back on the one who loves us more than anything and brought us into being is so horrific and obscene, there is not, in principle, anything we could ourselves do to make that matter right again. The good news, and indeed good news this is God never intended us to be able to make that matter right again. God intended to make the matter right himself. Like any loving father, God saw his children struggling and in need of some, let's be honest here, serious assistance. And like any other loving father, God was and is willing to give his struggling children whatever assistance they need to be successful. But he is not willing to let this happen without a lesson being learned along the way or to do everything himself. To assist someone you love does not mean to do everything for them. That would be enabling. But that you should give them whatever amount of leverage they need to make it out of the mess they're in, if, that is, they're so willing to extricate themselves to begin with, and so glean some important insight and gain some worthwhile amount of strength or courage or wisdom along the way. And that is exactly what God has decided to do for us through his Son, Jesus Christ. That is the whole point of the atonement. Knowing there were no actions humans could ever take in a finite lifespan to rectify the seemingly infinite injustice committed against God through sin, he knew he would need to settle this matter himself and would do so through the sacrificial death of his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. This is how what seems an impossibility is made both possible and actual, how God, who is all loving on one hand and all just on another, deals with the flagrant rebellion of humanity. To simply forget about it or allow bygones to be bygones would betray God's perfect justice, but to punish humans indefinitely would betray God's perfect mercy. Christ on the cross, as appalling as that initially seems, is really and truly the most just and compassionate act ever committed in the entirety of human experience. Nothing could be more right than what Christ gave for us. He could take the punishment because he was God, and only because he was God and therefore perfect would the punishment count. We had committed the gravest offense that could ever be committed or conceived, an offense so high and so unjust, and yet God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son to redeem it. That is how much God loves us. That is how much Jesus wants us to know him. Now, how the particulars of the atonement work isn't a matter of tremendous importance for our purposes today. The only thing a person need know at this point is that the atonement, that is, the sacrificial offering of God's only Son, Jesus Christ, did in fact work. It was the necessary rectifying agent, the one perfect and reconciliatory act needed to bring us back into a loving, saving relationship with our Heavenly Father and King. That is, so long as we choose to accept it. Not all of us do. So far, we can see that Christianity has already answered some of life's biggest questions for us. We come from God and are made for God. Our identity is also found in God, and more particularly in the person of Christ. We are composite entities, body and soul. And so now only two other questions remain. How are we to behave, and where, in particular, are we going next? Here again, Christ, and arguably Christ alone, has the answer for us. We are to behave as Christ behaved. It is as simple as that. I believe this point gives even more support to the prior evidence of Christ's incarnation and resurrection. Act a certain way, might we expect of him to send an example of what that might look like? That example is, of course, the perfect example, an ideal to which no human will attain. But he gave us instructions to make the attempt anyway, and that in doing so, we would achieve not only a deeper relationship with God himself, but a life that is full of meaning and flourishing and that will eventually lead us to heaven. Christian morality, then, is not just some arbitrary set of rules or some meta-narrative power grab or whatever else the kids are saying these days. Rather, Christian morality, and I think it is fair to say this of many other moral codes as well, is a set of instructions for getting the most out of life and being mostly happy within it. We say mostly happy because Christians believe perfect happiness is reserved for what's to come. But imperfect happiness, as St. Thomas Aquinas would have it, is to be had here on earth so long as we do our best to imitate Christ. Love God above everything and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the gist of Christian morality, though further and deeper principles could be explored through what have come to be known as the four cardinal: prudence, temperance, justice, fortitude, and three theological: faith, hope, and love virtues. It is beyond the scope of this project, however, to get into each of those principles now, but it is within the scope of this project to make it known that Christ answers very clearly the question of how we're to behave. We're to behave as close as we can to how he behaved. Finally, where are we going? Well, it is written within the Christian doctrine that we have something of a choice in that matter. We can either go to God, which is heaven, or we can go away from God, which is hell. Ultimately, however, the choice is ours to make. God only leaves the options open and extends the invitation. He does not force anybody who does not want to be with him to go to heaven. That would be against God's will for human freedom and love. It would make God into something of a monster when you think about it. If God loves us and wants us to be free, he must give us the option of choosing for ourselves, which must include the option of choosing to go away from God. He must give us the existence of hell. The doctrine is unpleasant, I admit. No person has ever much enjoyed the contemplation of eternal separation from God, which is what hell is. But in light of all the rest of Christian theology and philosophy and everything we know about Christ, which is most important, there is no escaping the reality that such a place as hell exists. It is as real as the devil himself. And it exists because it has to exist if we're going to keep on believing that God loves us. It is only on the surface, in the way most children think of the doctrine of hell, that such a place of separation seems inconsistent with God. Properly understood, we see that the existence of hell is inevitable for there to be any real meaning or choice or direction in life. Now, whether a Christian wants to think of hell as an actual literal dungeon of fire and brimstone is a matter, I believe, of one's own taste. The only true thing we know about hell is that it's a place where people go who do not want and possibly cannot stand being with God. This, of course, leads us to a consideration of that final doctrine of the Christian religion, which is the opposite of hell. Most of us would consider this place to be heaven. Now, I have talked to many people who do not believe in heaven because they say it sounds too good to be true, a sort of fairy tale of the highest rank. But I have come to believe this objection is an affirmation when you really look into it. For if God is all-loving, which most of these people would agree that he is, who themselves cannot imagine heaven being for real, then surely he wills the greatest joy for all of whom he loves, since to will anything less than that would give us a God who is somehow not quite as worthy of the title, somehow less than being perfectly good. It would give us a God that is perhaps good in some ways, but not the best in all ways, which is intolerably inconsistent with who we know God is. What I am really saying is this: if God exists, and if Jesus is God, we should not only hope for heaven, we should expect it. It would be, on the one hand, insulting to God to suggest he could not give us the existence of heaven, as if it were somehow below his power, and on the other hand, blasphemous to insinuate he wouldn't, as if he weren't good enough to do so. Just remember what heaven is. Heaven is complete and eternal communion with God, who alone is our highest good and greatest joy, even if we don't fully recognize the truth of that now. The details are somewhat fuzzy so far as what Christ promised would happen there, but he did make it clear that our life in heaven will be both blissful and everlasting. So whatever the details may happen to be, I'm fine with that. It's not the details I'm concerned about. It's the outcome. This, of course, brings to mind all those people who ask if we'll be having sex in heaven or if dogs can come, and if not, why should we ever want to go to a place as boring as that? But this is like kids who ask if they'll still be able to have candy when they start enjoying sex. Children, said Peter Kreeft once, when you start enjoying sex, candy is going to be the last thing on any of your minds. I believe that is a good attitude to maintain when thinking about heaven as well. So, heaven is a real place, and it's a place that God intends for us and hopes for all of us to go. God, as Christ and the Bible inform us, wills that no person ever be separated from him. But God also cannot force creatures who are free into anything they don't choose for themselves. That is the real risk, and why what we do here on earth matters not only imminently, but ultimately. Our destiny is not determined. We choose how things wind up by deciding on whom we want to love above all, God or ourselves. That is a doctrine of Christianity. That is a difference of Jesus and a difference he makes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat, for this extraordinary presentation. I'd like to open up the phone lines now for our listeners, if anybody would like to call. The number is 515-604-9344, using access code 914121#. I'll give you the number again. It's 515-604-9344 with the access code 914121#. 121 pound. So we have about 12 minutes remaining if anybody would like to call and engage Pat on these questions. Pat, while we're waiting for somebody to call, I do have a question. Or
Sure.
You had pointed out the nature of love and in the way in which Christ loved us, in the way in which we are to behave in love for one another. So we know that our secular age, the age in which we live, is very much fallen into secularity, or a non-religious worldview, where man is the measure of all things, and where man pursues what Pope John Paul II called a radical autonomy. That is, he's not going to live by God's law, but by his own. So when the pagans saw the first early Christians, they were amazed. They were struck with a simple observation: look at how they love one another. In the way in which we love one another, in the way in which we behave toward one another, what are some things that we can look for in Christians that would make them distinctive from non-Christians, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think this is an excellent question, and so much through as I wrote this paper, and by the way, there's a lot sprinkled in here. That the main thrust of my presentation there was that sort of probabilistic argument for the resurrection, but we did dive a little bit into theodicy and theology. So I by no means want to claim that I am I'm a philosopher in my background. I'm still an amateur when it comes to the theology stuff, but I think I can wrestle with this one. And a lot of what I talked about is really a reflection of my own realizations and my own learnings, and how once becoming a Christian, and I use this term like a truly converted Christian, this whole idea of Christian morality sort of falls out automatically. It really is. This is why we call it a theological virtue, right? It's a gift. And I never understood that before, Dr. Mahfood. And for years I studied Aquinas before I actually became a Christian, and I did not understand what he meant when he said that love or theological virtues were a gift. It didn't make sense. But then I experienced it, and then I got it. And, well, this is a gift. This isn't something that I earned or was able to develop myself. This is something that sort of came out and is developing now more or less automatically once you have that conversion, that authentic conversion experience. So if you would have even told me, a couple of years ago that I would be giving a talk like this, or doing all the things that I'm doing with my church now, I just would not have believed you. I would have stood there with my mouth open. The Christian idea of love, or agape, and you probably have a better idea of the the language behind it, of willing the good of the other for other. You want to do what is good for somebody else because you love them, and you want what is best for them. So it's not like a romantic love. It's not like an affection kind of love. So I think the first thing you have to do is get clear on what exactly is Christian love, and that's the best definition that I can give for it. It's willing the good of the other for other, and that might look very differently at different times. Sometimes it might mean sitting next to somebody who needs consoling, who just needs to be held and to be listened to. Other times it might mean tough love. It might mean confronting somebody who's dealing with addictive or unhealthy behavior, and putting yourself into an uncomfortable position to address the issues and to really try and get somebody help. So it lines up with one of the other cardinal virtues, which is prudence, right? Prudence is the virtue that helps us orient all the other virtues, and I would say this is also true for love. Is what from my wisdom, from my experience, can I say is really best for this person right now? What is it that they really need? What is really good for them? And that's Christian love, is trying to answer that question, and whatever that answer is, and so maybe you'll get it right. Yeah, I think prayer is really helpful in this, to try and get it right. Maybe you won't get it completely right, but that's what the act is. So it's not just one blanket feeling or expression or anything like that. It's very contextual. It's often very individual, of thinking, what does this person really need given their circumstances, given where they are in life, and how can I best give that to them? So I think that's a way that people can start to think about the theological virtue of love, or sometimes goes by the name of charity as well.
Well, certainly. And we know, and that's a good way to look at it, is somebody is not using another person for his or her own means, but truly valuing the other person's humanity and personhood. John Paul II, writing before he became Pope and publishing as Carol Wojtyła, a book called Love and Responsibility, distinguishes between love and use. And he says use is the manipulation of somebody else for one's own personal gain, and love would be its opposite, truly engaging what is good for that other person, over and above any use value that other person may have. So it's not really a Kantian sort of formula, but it's a truly Christian one. So what if the other person says, this would make me happy, this is what would benefit me most? Can you do this for me? What if what the other person wants is not necessarily for the other person's best good?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's sort of a fundamental one. I think this is where natural law and the work of Aquinas can really help us out. It's not like kind of what Spinoza would say. Things aren't good just because you desire them, right? We can think of many instances where people desire things that are really not good for them. We talked about addictions before, but even just various unhealthy behaviors, right, makes that principle immediately obvious. So things aren't good just because you desire them. Rather, some things are really good, and those are the things that you ought to desire. Those are the things that are really good for you. And when you understand the words really good, you then understand what it is that you ought to do. So in the Christian sense, what is really good for you? Well, the highest good, the greatest conceivable good is a relationship with God. But there's many other good things in relationship to that too. And that's where virtue ethics and natural law and the work with Aquinas can really help us make sense of what those things are. When we look at the cardinal virtues, right, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, and the theological virtues, we can, and this is true for all of us, and this was a major realization for me. I still do. I'm working on it. Certainly don't want to make it seem like I'm some type of, shining example here by any means. I've already got my next confession scheduled. But some things are really good for us. And what we have to do is work on, and thankfully we have grace to help us get it done, is work on reorienting our desires to come in line with those things that cause us to flourish and cause us to be happy. And it's not enough to say, well, no, this is what I like doing. This is what makes me happy. Because it actually is possible that somebody's could be so disordered that they actually do get happiness from really perverse things. And one hesitates to mention some examples of that, but clearly it's conceivable. But even if that's the case, even if they're getting pleasure for something that's really perverse, doesn't mean that is a really good thing for them, and certainly not for the rest of society. So I think when we understand the teleological nature, that God really has put purposes and designs into things and people, there are some actions, some behaviors that are really good for us, that will really cause us to flourish, that will really provide the type of society that is steeped in Christian love. And there are other actions that are disordered, that are perverse. And it's by coming into that relationship with Christ, being filled with those theological virtues, and having that grace and community to support you, but then studying and understanding the cardinal virtues as well, I think can really help to answer that question. And what you will discover, and if there's one last point I want to make, I'm happy to keep going, right? Is again, as I hinted in the article, morality and religion is not, Christian religion is not about some arbitrary set of restrictions and rules. Morality is a blueprint for the human machine designed by God. This are the instructions for how He wants us to live, because He wants what is really good for us. He wants us to have that perfect happiness. So I think that's the better way to see morality and to see religion, not as some do this, don't do that, in kind of a hard dictatorial sense, but as a loving Father giving us instructions to be the best creatures that we can be.
Very good. We do have one caller, and we have 2 minutes, so I've told this caller to keep her her comments and questions down to 60 seconds. Are you willing to take the call?
Yes, of course.
Okay, the caller is 9-year-old Eva, who's listened to the past half hour of your talk and has formed a question in her mind.
Oh, great. Kids
So,
ask the best theological and philosophical questions, so now I'm a little nervous because they're also the most difficult ones.
All right, in 60 seconds, here is Eva.
First of all, my dad put me up to this. What does this mean for a kid?
What does this mean for a kid? You know, this is I might have to take more than 60 seconds to answer this. I have 3 kids of my own, and this is a question I've spent so much time thinking about. And the wonderful thing is, like I just said, Eva, kids, you know, like God designed kids to just ask all the most important questions right away in life. Like, why are we here? Well, you know, what is the purpose of all of this? And I think one of the great problems in society today is that these questions are either hand-waved away as being unimportant or silly or uninteresting, or they're given really weak sort of platitudinous answers of like, oh, that's just the way it is, or God did it that way. And I think that can be really undermining to a person's faith, because when you understand the Christian religion and tradition, you'll see its deep intellectual roots of just how much sense it makes of reality and how synthesizing it is. That was one thing for me. So I think if any of this means anything for kids, I mean, the sooner you start studying this and diving into it and trying to absorb it as fully and deeply as you can, the more stability you're going to have through your entire life, a stability that I lacked for many, many years, that I wish I would have had if I had had that philosophical. I had philosophical training early on. It was an existentialism. It wasn't quite this God. But if I had the right philosophical training and the right theological training, I think it will give you the stability that you need to face just about any other challenge that you will come up against in life. And that's what faith is, right? Faith is trusting in that which you have good reason to believe. And part of the reason faith is a virtue is because you continue to believe it regardless of how you feel on a particular day, or whatever type of emotional roller coaster you may go on, because it is what you have good reason to believe. It shouldn't be something that's variable. And that's another thing that I never understood until I actually became a Christian, is why the heck is faith a virtue? But when you think of it like that, you can see, yeah, there's a lot of fortitude in that. That makes sense. So stability is the one. But I mean, the most important thing is having that personal relationship with Jesus. Nothing is more valuable than that. And the earlier you can establish that, the earlier you can enter into that. Oh my God, how much I wish I would have had that when I was a kid. So you're very blessed to have the father and the tradition that you do, and I'll be praying for you, and I wish you all the best throughout the years.
Well, thank you very much. We've been listening to Pat Flynn on today's Two Wings seminar, and Pat, we're grateful that you came, and we're looking forward to having you back. Eva will give the station sign-off. Eva?
Thank you for listening to WCAT Radio. God bless and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.